Hi everybody, my name's Kate Jennings. I'm the Head of Site Conservation Policy at the RSPB, and I've been asked to talk to you about progress in establishing protected areas in the UK. So I'm just going to give you a brief history of protected area designation for seabirds, both on land and at sea, with an obvious focus on roseate terns. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges for the future. So first, a quick sprint through the legislation underpinning site protection. The first kind of meaningful step in this direction was the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act in 1949, which introduced sites of special scientific interest. But they didn't really get useful because the law around them was so weak until the Wildlife and Countryside Act in 1981. In 1979, along came the EU Birds Directive, which required the designation of special protection areas for birds which are listed on Annex 1 of the directive and for regularly occurring migratory species. And then since then we've had the national marine legislation in each of the 4 countries of the UK, the Marine Acts. That was 2009 for England and Wales, 2010 for Scotland and 2013 for Northern Ireland. And those provide for the designation of marine conservation zones in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and for marine protected areas in Scotland. Now, when it comes to the vast majority of seabirds, the most relevant of these, at least to date, are SSSIs on land and special protection areas on land and at sea. And this is because national approaches to site selection under the Marine Acts have mostly excluded so-called mobile species. In limited exceptions, they have included black guillemot, which is the only UK seabird which doesn't qualify for SPA classification under the Birds Directive, or have focused on a very small number of areas where seabirds would not normally qualify for SPA designation. Rathlin would be an example. Protection for seabird prey species is often incidentally provided by special areas of conservation designated under the EU Habitats Directive and by marine protected areas and marine conservation zones. But these measures are not targeted, they're not intended to protect the seabirds, nor are they coordinated, and that leaves a large gap in the coherence of the network. So to begin with protection of colonies, and in a world where all things are relative, this is the relatively easy bit. There's been a long history of site designation on land. For example, Coquette Island was first notified as a SSSI in 1954. There was progress on colony designation of special protection areas from 1981 onwards under the Birds Directive. Coquette and the Farns were both classified in the 1980s, and Solent and Southampton Water in 1998 in England. In Northern Ireland, Larne Loch was classified in 1997, in Scotland the Forth Islands in 1990, and in Wales, Ynys Ferreg, I'm sure I've said that wrong, Conway Bay and the Skerries was classified in 1992. This in part was driven by a series of terrestrial UK SPA reviews undertaken by the UK SPA and Ramsar Scientific Working Group. And the most recent of those was published in 2016. It found that the network for roseate terns, this is just in relation to colonies, was sufficient. Meanwhile, in the Republic of Ireland, Rockabill, the Dalkey Islands and Ladies Island were all classified between 2003 and 2010. So the question is, are protected colonies safe places to breed, or are they safe places to starve? Site protection mechanisms are well developed, if imperfect, on land, so there are controls on development and on land management. But SSSI protection does not confer any protection on features beyond the site boundaries, so there's no protection when the birds leave the colonies to feed. And while special protection area protection does in theory extend to the features beyond the boundaries of the site, that only works if you know where those features go and you can link the features to the site. So for example, if you're doing marine spatial planning, it assumes that you know where the seabirds from a particular colony go to feed. Often we don't. And it assumes that if you're doing survey at sea and you find some terns, you know which colony they belong to so that you can understand potential impacts. So when it comes to securing protection at sea, there's been a long history of foot dragging and inaction in the UK across all 4 countries. By 2012, that was 31 years after the deadline for implementation of the Birds Directive in the UK, we had just 3 marine SPAs in UK waters for 2 species in a single season. So that was red-throated diver and common scoter in the non-breeding season. And we had no clear commitment to or progress towards any more. Therefore, in 2012, the RSPB submitted a complaint to the European Commission on the UK's failure to implement the Birds Directive at sea. This focused on a lack of survey, the lack of designation, and the lack of other special conservation measures for seabirds at sea. But at the heart of our argument was the assertion that the most suitable territories for seabirds, that's what the Birds Directive requires you to designate, must surely include their foraging sites. Although the marine complaint fell victim to a round of pre-referendum closures in 2016, by then the EC was in any case pursuing its own action on failures to designate both special protection areas and special areas of conservation at sea by a number of member states, the UK included. And there can be little question that the complaint had the desired laxative effect. Between 2012 and 2016, proposals were brought forward for about 30 more sites, almost all of which have been subject to formal consultation, and about half of which are now formally classified as special protection areas. Now these came in tranches. First there were the maintenance extensions to existing seabird breeding colony SPAs. So those are areas of sea immediately adjacent to colonies which are used for so-called maintenance activities, things like preening and resting, by a number of cliff nesting species. Next came a tranche of inshore sites used by wintering divers, ducks and grebes. And then the last big tranche focused on foraging areas for breeding terns. And as a result of that tranche, both Northumberland Marine and the Anglesey Tern SPAs were classified for roseate terns. In terms of designation, there are still substantial gaps in the UK marine SPA network. There are still no marine SPAs to protect foraging sites of any of the UK's cliff nesting seabirds, although some have been proposed in Scotland. Some sites that have been proposed and consulted on are still stuck in the pipeline. That includes 14 in Scotland, 2 in Northern Ireland and 1 in England. And significantly, while there have now been 3 reviews of the adequacy of the terrestrial network undertaken by the UK SPA and Ramsar Scientific Working Group, there has to date been no published review of the adequacy of the UK's marine SPA network. One has long been promised, but unlike on land, the process has been undertaken entirely behind closed doors and has stalled at regular intervals over a number of years. The recommendations of the 3rd terrestrial UK SPA review, published in 2016, included that a review of SPA provision in the marine environment is needed for at least 49 species, and that included roseate tern. The Scottish Government has recently undertaken a marine SPA review for Scottish waters only, which highlighted the need for the 14 sites they still have stuck in the pipeline and identified residual insufficiencies that will remain once those are classified. Although for roseate tern, an absence of breeding adults at Scottish colony SPAs meant that no conclusion was reached for that species. An obvious question in respect of terns for such a review to assess is the decision to only classify as SPA the foraging areas for a subset of the SPA breeding colonies. In contrast, for example, to the approach taken to maintenance extensions for cliff nesting colonies, where standard extension zones were added to all SPA colonies classified for the species known to make use of maintenance areas adjacent to their colonies. So, challenges for the future. In the context of Brexit, there are real concerns about review and completion of the marine SPA network. There is no guarantee that the long-promised marine sufficiency review will materialise, and there are concerns about the rigour and transparency of that review. Also, without the watchdog and enforcement functions of the European Commission and the European Court of Justice, what hope of challenge and of driving further progress? Now, obligations under the Birds and Habitats directives relating to the identification, designation, protection and management of SBAs have all been carried over, largely intact, into post-EU exit revisions to the habitat regulations across all 4 countries of the UK. These will come into effect when the transition period ends. However, the same powers that allowed governments of the UK to make these changes could also be used to unpick them. And while we could still have some sort of Office for Environmental Protection in England ready by the end of the transition period, unlikely though that increasingly seems, equivalent proposals in the other countries are much less advanced, and there are real concerns about the independence and strength of domestic watchdogs and about the enforcement and challenge options that will be available to them. On the plus side, there does appear to be a growing global consensus that there should be a new target agreed under the Convention on Biological Diversity, so an international target for 30% of land and seas protected and well managed by 2030. Now, if that gets taken seriously and reflected in legally binding targets at the domestic level, that could drive some further progress. However, it should go without saying that designation is a means to an end and not an end in itself. It's only as good as the rigour with which protection is applied, the implementation of effective management measures, and the quality of monitoring that's undertaken to inform these and to assess their efficacy. And while we have seen progress on designation over the last decade, management and monitoring is woefully inadequate. Analysis by the Joint Nature Conservation Committee showed that management measures have only been fully implemented in 10% of marine sites in the UK, and only 13% of sites have full monitoring in place. That seems bad, but was maybe rose-tinted, as in a new analysis that was released by Greenpeace on Wednesday this week. They found that only 5 of the UK's 73 marine protected areas may be progressing towards conservation targets, and that only 2 have long-term site condition monitoring available. On the back of that analysis, they concluded that the UK's marine protected areas are a collection of paper parks, lines drawn on a map, but with little management or regular site condition monitoring to ensure they are progressing towards their conservation targets. Sadly, I can't argue with that, and here, as for the future of designation, the concerns about the rigour of and accountability for action in the UK post-Brexit apply, and the nature of future targets and enforcement mechanisms across the 4 countries of the UK will be key. Thank you very much for listening.